I have to do a disclosure here. We have a 96. I volunteered for your boss.
1996.
In his house race. So
oh my God.
I just want to get that out of the way, lest anyone thinks there's...
that was Joe Weisenthal in 1996.
So,
how old were you?
And that's Bernie Sanders in 1996?
It's just
he hasn't aged a bit.
So got to get the important disclosure out of the way.
You love to see it.
Yeah. Before we go on. So I'm curious, in the last several weeks, I think for a lot of people, the prospect of Sanders winning the nomination has started to become very real. So I'm curious, in a general election, with unemployment at 3.5%, people's satisfaction of the economy, the highest where it was in multiple decades by some measures, how challenging will that be to run on a message that's very much about the economy?
Well, I think what average, ordinary, everyday voters realize is that even when the economy is doing well, individuals don't always feel it, right? So as Bernie Sanders says repeatedly, there are a very small handful of people, 3 to 6 people who own as much wealth as the bottom 50% of Americans. And when we look at the gains economically that this country has seen, they have been distributed to the top 1% and not distributed equally among all those people who are working so hard to make that value occur, right? So people don't need to have their hands held and have it explained to them that even if the economy is doing well, real wages have not been going up. It's harder and harder to afford housing. People are saddled with an enormous amount of student loan debt. The interest rates on that debt are growing enormously, and that they need something to change. And if someone is going to run on nothing much changing, as Joe Biden has said, nothing will fundamentally change, that is not a winning message.
So, but I mean, looking to the general election as well, I mean, you're going up a man. I remember the Trump campaign used the same talking point during his campaign where they talked about this idea that unemployment really wasn't a number, it was this feeling. There are a lot of people, his supporters, who feel like the economy is doing well, no matter what the numbers say. They feel that they've benefited. So how does Bernie Sanders reach out to those people and say that I'm the better option than the current administration?
Well, if you're one of the 1% who enormously benefited from Trump's tax cuts, I believe you are feeling like the economy is doing better. And his supporters actually did skew more affluent. But when I talk to a number of Americans around the country, including people who identify as Republicans and independents, remember, Bernie Sanders does better with independents than anyone else in the field and has done so historically. What they identify is a feeling of struggle, a feeling of precarity, a feeling like their dollar doesn't go as far as it used to. And that is what is really resonating with people when you look at the town halls that Bernie has been holding around the country, where people are pouring their hearts and souls out about the health care experiences they've been having in particular. With, again, remember, medical bankruptcy being the #1 cause of bankruptcy in this country. That is a phenomenon that can't just be chalked up to, the ups and downs of the economy. Right. That is a real long-term problem that has yet to be addressed by any of the other candidates in this race.
President Trump has started to fixate on Senator Sanders a little bit more this month than he had in the past. In the past, it was mainly Joe Biden, but right now he's really started to hone in on Senator Sanders. And of course, part of that is speaking to the white working class voters that may be more vulnerable to being picked off by Senator Sanders. What's the #1 reason for the average President Trump supporter to consider Bernie Sanders, especially if they're white working class and perhaps not benefiting from the economy the way that you said the 1% is?
Yeah. What I think is really interesting is that we often talk about the white working class as though their interests are completely separate and apart from those of the working classes in general. And what the Bernie Sanders campaign is doing is disrupting this idea that we can divide people up and pit them against each other based on race or other identity factors, and say one of the biggest shared identities in this country that has been largely ignored by both political parties is that of the working class as a whole. So when we talk to black working class people, Hispanic working class people, white working class people, they all identify healthcare, education, and the economy as their principal concerns. And when they're asked who is trusted most on those issues, particularly healthcare, Bernie Sanders again and again tops that list.
Why can't Senator Sanders seem to gain traction with African Americans?
Oh, I dispute that premise.
Well, what are his numbers like?
Well, Bernie Sanders is actually #2 with African American voters, and according to a recent poll, African Americans were about evenly divided between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden when they were asked who they were most likely or open or willing to vote for. So there's a lot of gains for Bernie Sanders there, and he has already demonstrated that he has a much better ability to connect with black voters than any candidate in this race other than Joe Biden, who of course is benefiting from a lot of name recognition and being the vice president to our first black president.
One of your competitors, obviously, Elizabeth Warren, was really dogged for a long time about the question, how are you going to pay for all of your plans? And there is this perception that the Sanders campaign hasn't put forth as detailed plans in terms of matching expenditures and tax revenue dollar for dollar the same way Warren has. Is there going to be more flesh on the bones in terms of Sanders' tax and spending plans at some point?
Well, I'd like to remind you, it's Bernie Sanders that wrote the damn bill, right? When we're talking about what the actual legislation is, who's done the hard work of writing what Medicare for All, when we're talking about Medicare for All, there are a lot of people who have taken that name and tried to brand their campaigns with that very popular moniker. But the reality is it's only Bernie Sanders that has written the legislation that is currently before the Senate that is, in fact, Medicare for All. And it's not that he hasn't been asked the question, how can you pay for it? He has been asked, and he gave an answer that was clear enough and direct enough that people didn't feel like they had to keep repeating the answer to get to the bottom of what the truth is. Bernie Sanders has been transparent about the fact that with a small tax raise that's lower than what people are currently paying for, co-pays, premiums, and deductibles, they can have full, free point of service care in the way that every other industrialized country in the world provides for its citizens. We are currently paying twice as much for not the same quality of care that other people get across the world. And he's just, I think, been more persuasive and clear about getting that message across.
I want to ask you a question about a controversy over the last couple of days. The Sanders campaign trumpeting the fact that the popular podcaster Joe Rogan said that he was likely to vote for Sanders in the primary. People have criticized the fact that the campaign trumpeted that, given various controversial things Rogan has said in the past about people who are trans and so forth. How do you view who gets to, I mean, anyone can vote for anyone who wants, but where do you draw the line in terms of whose support gets to be amplified?
Well, look, I think that when you have a big tent multiracial coalition like we have, right, we have the most working class, the most diverse constituency of anybody in this race. There are going to be people in this tent that don't agree with every aspect of Sanders' policy. But what's important is that Bernie Sanders, unlike some politicians in the past, did not change anything about what he stands for to solicit the endorsement of someone like Joe Rogan. Instead, Bernie Sanders has the most robust policy for trans people in this race. He's the only one who is supporting a Medicare for All that would include transition surgery for trans people, hormone therapy, full mental health care for everyone in this country, and who has a plan for homelessness, which 1 out of every 5 trans people experiences during their lives. I think folks need to look at what is being done to elicit this kind of support and really maintain skepticism about candidates who would change who they are to get support, and be really clear about the fact that Bernie Sanders has not done that.